On February 11, 2026, the after-school crowd around Broadway and West 238th Street started running before most people understood what happened. Three teenagers had been hit near the 238 corner store with sirens closing in while backpacks, phones, and food orders got left behind. Christopher C.J. Redding tried to get away after a bullet caught him in the back, but that corner had already changed his story. Two younger teenagers would survive leg wounds, while CJ would be rushed to St. Barnabas Hospital with no time left. The cops had a shooting scene, a crowd full of scared kids, and one problem nobody could answer yet. Christopher Redding was not the kid anybody expected to find lying there. That Wednesday started like any regular school day for CJ Redding, a 16-year-old 10th grader from John F. Kennedy High School in the Bronx. He had football in his system, school behind him for the day, and regular teenage plans sitting right in front of him. After classes let out, he reached out to his mother, Champagne Christian, asking for money so he could grab something to eat. She sent him $25, thinking her son was heading for Chipotle, then coming back home like he normally would. That small transfer became one of the last real moves between a mother and her boy before the block swallowed everything. CJ ended up near the McDonald's at Broadway and West 238th Street after one of his friends called him from inside that spot. The location already had a reputation in Kingsbridge, sitting between the 238 corner store deli, a bus stop, and the heavy after-school traffic that filled the sidewalk. Kids from different schools moved through there daily, buying food, waiting for buses, laughing loudly, pressing each other, sometimes turning small words into bigger problems. That afternoon, something sparked inside the McDonald's, with reports pointing to an argument that moved quickly from talk to tension. Nobody standing around that crowd knew one small confrontation was about to turn into a shooting scene. The situation spilled out onto West 238th Street near Putnam Avenue and John M. Kingsbridge Road, where the crowd had less cover. Police later looked at the moment as gang-related, with one report saying a shooter asked CJ and others whether they were from A block. That question mattered to investigators, even though nobody confirmed that CJ or the wounded teenagers were connected to that crew. The streets move dirty like that sometimes, with one wrong answer, one wrong face, or one wrong corner turning dangerous fast. Within moments, gunfire cracked through the block, sending students, pedestrians, and nearby customers scattering in every direction. Regional Hall, a resident watching from her first-floor apartment, heard 5 shots and saw hundreds of kids running across the area. The panic outside was real, with teenagers ducking between parked cars, pushing away from the bus stop, and trying to figure out where the bullets came from. CJ was hit in the back while trying to flee, which told investigators he was not standing there looking for trouble. A 15-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl were also struck in their right legs, leaving 3 young victims on one Bronx block. By the time EMS arrived, the corner had already turned from after-school noise into flashing lights, blood, fear, and police tape. All 3 victims were taken to St. Barnabas Hospital in Belmont, where doctors worked on the wounded teenagers, while CJ's family still tried to understand the call. The 2 younger victims survived, but Christopher Redding was pronounced dead after a bullet took a life that had barely started moving. Outside the scene, police photos capture his backpack lying on the sidewalk near evidence markers, looking like something a student planned to pick up later. That image hit hard because it showed the difference between what CJ brought to the block and what somebody else brought there. He had a school bag, a food plan, and football dreams, while somebody else had a gun. The early confusion made the case even heavier as police searched for several young people wearing dark clothes with reports shifting from 3 males to 6. Surveillance later showed 4 faces connected to the moments before the shooting, including 3 males and 1 female, some wearing dark clothing and blue masks. Detectives still needed names, motives, and a clean path from the McDonald's argument to the shots on the street. Yet one detail started standing out before the full case came together, since CJ did not appear to be the intended target. If Christopher Redding was just caught in the wrong lane, then the real question became sharper. Who were those young men actually hunting that day? Before that corner turned his name into a headline, Christopher C.J. Redding had already built a real reputation in youth football. He was born in Toombs County, Georgia, a place known far more for Vidalia onions than New York street politics. His family moved to New York City when he was still very young, bringing him to the Bronx before he even knew what that move meant. Over the years, he grew through places like Belmont Avenue, Honeywell Avenue, and Mount Eden, each neighborhood shaping a different part of him. Mount Eden sat only a few miles from Kingsbridge, but in the Bronx, a few miles can feel like another world. Football became the thing that gave CJ direction, discipline, attention, and a name people spoke with respect. He played with the Bronx Colts, LBX teams, and fast break flag football, moving through youth programs where coaches could see his talent early. He was not just another kid running routes for fun, since people around those teams remembered how he changed the games. LBX Sports once named him Bantam Player of the Week after he stacked 2 rushing touchdowns, 1 receiving touchdown, 1 forced fumble, and 1 recovery. That kind of stat line showed a young player who was not waiting for the game to come toward him. Coach Christopher Lopez watched CJ grow over several years, seeing a boy who tightened his focus while chasing football with real seriousness. Lopez later helped organize support for the family, but before grief entered the story, he knew CJ as a kid trying to improve. Robin Ryder, whose son played fast break with him, remembers CJ as part of a dangerous group of wide receivers that other teams hated facing. Her son looked up to him, which says plenty about the kind of pull CJ had among younger players. In youth sports, that kind of respect does not come from talking loudly. It comes from showing up every week. By November 5th, 2025, CJ had joined the Kennedy Knights at John F. Kennedy High School, stepping into varsity football with limited time left that season. He was listed as a running back, but his background showed a kid who could touch the ball from different spots. He played in a 36-31 win over South Shore High School on November 7th, then appeared again against Lincoln High School on November 15th. Kennedy lost that season-ending game 51-36, which meant CJ only got 2 official games before everything stopped. 2 games were not enough for anybody to really see what he could become. His father, Brian Corley, saw the growth outside football too, especially in the way CJ talked about training and getting stronger. During their last time together, CJ told him to look at how big he was getting, speaking like a kid proud of his progress. They played their last one-on-one basketball game, a normal father-son moment that later carried a weight nobody expected. Corley remembered his son as focused, calling him the greatest kid anybody could have, which hit different after the shooting. Champagne, Christian, knew that same side of him, the son who asked for food money, stayed connected, and still moved like a regular teenager. That is what made the story so painful for the football community, since CJ was not known as a gang member or street problem. The New York City Youth Football League honored him with words about his strength, presence, and light, while teammates treated his death like a family loss. Kids who had lined up beside him now had to stand at vigils wearing team gear near the same block where he fell. His name moved from rosters, highlight memories, and youth league posts into news reports about another Bronx teenager killed by gunfire. That shift was cold, and everybody around him felt how wrong it sounded. While CJ was building himself through football, the corner at Broadway and West 238th Street was building a different kind of reputation. Kingsbridge is not some hidden back block, since that intersection sits in daily motion with students, commuters, workers, fast food traffic, and buses. The McDonald's there already carried a bloody memory from 2016 when manager Adam Garcia was fatally stabbed during his night shift. Locals still remembered that killing, which gave the restaurant a history people mention when violence returned to the area. By 2026, the same corner was once again tied to a young life cut down near food counters and bus lanes. The after-school crowd made the area complicated, since teenagers from different blocks often gathered there before heading home. Some came for food, some came for friends, some came to be seen, while others brought tension from somewhere else. Residents spoke about fights around the bus stop, groups clustering outside the McDonald's, and the feeling that police presence had thinned out over time. The 50th Precinct Station House was only about 1 block away, which made the shooting feel even more insulting to grieving parents. When gunshots rang out near a police station during school dismissal, people in Kingsbridge wanted to know how nobody stopped it sooner. The neighborhood carried many layers, with Kingsbridge, Riverdale, Fieldston, Spartan, Deweyville, and Marble Hill all falling within the 50th Precinct's wider coverage. That meant officers had to patrol areas with very different money, housing, street conditions, and public safety concerns. On one side of the Northwest Bronx, families lived around more stable blocks, while nearby corners still dealt with youth crews, guns, and daily pressure. That uneven map shaped how people talked about CJ's death, since some saw one random shooting while others recognized a pattern. For residents like Victor, who had known the area for more than 20 years, the corner already had big problems. This is where CJ's world collided with the street rhythm he was not living inside. He had coaches, teams, school, family, last games, workouts, and plans that pointed him towards something bigger than the block. The street around him had bus stop arguments, old violence, younger crews, mosques, cameras, police dispatches, and teenagers carrying weapons into normal public spaces. Those worlds do not always meet, but on February 11th, they crossed at the worst possible moment. While CJ spent years preparing his body for football, 3 other young men were drifting toward a completely different future. Their names would come next, and the hunt for them would move from the Bronx all the way to Connecticut. The surveillance cameras around Broadway and West 238th Street started filling gaps that frightened witnesses could not explain, which slowly pushed detectives toward a smaller group than the early police radio suggested. Dispatchers first broadcast descriptions mentioning 3 males dressed in black. Then another update expanded the search to 6 young men running toward West 231st Street and Bailey Avenue. Hours later, investigators narrowed the focus after reviewing security footage taken before the shooting, discovering 3 males together with 1 female wearing dark clothing, while some covered parts of their faces with blue masks. Those images mattered more than rumors moving around the neighborhood, since cameras showed the group gathering near a nearby building before walking toward the same intersection where Christopher Redding lost his life. Detectives still lacked names, although the hunt had finally moved beyond frightened eyewitness accounts into something they could build inside a courtroom. The first break came only 3 days later when officers arrested 17-year-old Sean Caballero inside the confines of the 50th Precinct on February 14th placing one suspect in custody while the investigation kept expanding beyond New York City. Sean quickly became the youngest defendant tied to the shooting, although detectives believed he had not acted alone during those chaotic moments outside the McDonald's. Their attention shifted toward his older brother, Anthony Caballero, who was already gone, along with another 19-year-old identified as Zion Martinez from the Charlotte Gardens section of the Bronx. Instead of staying local, both young men traveled north into Norwich, Connecticut, probably believing distance would buy enough time to stay ahead of homicide detectives. That move only widened the investigation, bringing Connecticut authorities, local detectives, state police, and federal partners into the same search. Zion Martinez became the first one to slip, although it happened through an ordinary traffic stop instead of some dramatic chase across state lines. Norwich officers stopped the vehicle on March 4th, then quickly noticed Martinez trying to complicate his own identification while giving investigators reasons to look deeper. Their search uncovered approximately 3.6 grams of fentanyl, although that discovery became secondary after officers found 2 outstanding warrants connected to New York. One warrant carried allegations tied directly to Christopher Redding's killing, transforming what started as a narcotics arrest into the capture of a homicide suspect. Martinez landed behind bars on drug charges, interference allegations, plus fugitive status while waiting for extradition, leaving Anthony Caballero as the last major suspect still outside police custody. Authorities received information suggesting Anthony Caballero remained somewhere inside Norwich, which triggered a coordinated operation on March 20th involving Norwich Police, Connecticut State Police, the Emergency Services Unit, plus the United States Marshals Task Force. Officers surrounded a residence on Claremont Avenue before calling repeatedly for Anthony to surrender peacefully, although those commands produced silence instead of cooperation. Nearly 90 minutes passed before police released K9 Otto into the building, allowing the dog to search places officers could not safely clear themselves. Otto eventually found Anthony hiding inside a closet where the bites delivered to his left arm finally ended the standoff before officers placed him into custody. That arrest completed the roundup of the 3 principal male suspects while leaving one female, seen on surveillance footage, unidentified and still missing. By March 27th, Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark announced a grand jury indictment charging Sean Caballero, Anthony Caballero, and Zion Martinez with second-degree murder, first-degree manslaughter, attempted murder, criminal weapon possession, assault, plus reckless endangerment counts tied directly to the shooting. All 3 defendants appeared before Bronx Supreme Court Justices Pamela Goldsmith and Gail Roberts before being remanded without bail, moving the case from neighborhood speculation into formal criminal proceedings. Clark described Christopher Redding as another promising young life destroyed through illegal gun violence, although her remarks also pointed toward another tragedy unfolding inside the same generation. 3 teenagers now face decades inside prison, while another teenager already rested inside a cemetery, leaving 4 families carrying different versions of the same nightmare. Yet the investigation remained unfinished because detectives still searched for the unidentified female captured outside that building shortly before the shooting. While prosecutors prepared court filings, the Bronx responded with grief that stretched well beyond Christopher Redding's family, turning another neighborhood tragedy into a borough-wide conversation about youth violence. Bronx Borough President Vanessa Gibson stood near the crime scene, describing the shooting as another argument that escalated once somebody pulled out a firearm echoing concerns residents had repeated for years. City Council member Eric Denowitz called the killing horrifying while insisting high school students should never carry guns through neighborhood streets after classes ended. Representative Richie Torres urged witnesses to cooperate with investigators, repeating that Bronx children deserve to walk home without fearing random bullets after school dismissed. Their statements reflected public frustration, although many residents believed official words arrived much faster than lasting solutions. Christopher Redding's death also reopened memories surrounding another Bronx teenager whose story followed an equally cruel path years earlier, making many longtime residents immediately think about Angelique Yambo. On April 8th, 2022, Angelique left University Prep Charter High School before walking home through Melrose, unaware that Jeremiah Ryan was confronting rivals nearby with a ghost gun. Ryan fired toward intended targets, although one bullet traveled beyond the dispute before striking Angelique in the upper back, piercing vital organs, while two classmates also suffered gunshot wounds. She had nothing to do with the confrontation, just like Christopher Redding had nothing to do with the conflict unfolding outside the McDonald's 4 years later. Ryan eventually received a sentence of 15 years to life, while Angelique's family transformed their grief into the Angelique Yambo Foundation, hoping another child would never become another innocent name inside another memorial. Those stories kept overlapping across different years, different neighborhoods, and different investigations until the similarities became impossible to ignore, despite changing defendants, changing victims, and changing crime scenes. Angelique walked home from school before somebody else's dispute reached her, while Christopher planned to eat after school before another confrontation crossed his path. Both families watched court proceedings, both communities gathered for vigils, and both cases forced District Attorney Darcel Clark to stand before grieving parents, promising accountability through the justice system. Even with arrests moving quickly in Christopher's case, the larger pattern refused to disappear from Bronx streets. By the time detectives finished identifying the suspects connected to CJ's killing, New York had already recorded him as the second teenager lost to gun violence during 2026, proving the names kept changing while the cycle barely changed at all. I've continued the documentary in the same narrative style, keeping the focus on documented events and interconnected stories rather than adding unsupported details. While detectives pieced together surveillance footage, extradition paperwork, and grand jury evidence, Christopher Redding's parents were left trying to understand how an ordinary afternoon had collapsed into permanent loss. Champagne Christian kept returning to one small moment that refused to leave her mind, remembering the $25 she sent her son after he said he wanted Chipotle before coming home. She later explained that one of CJ's friends had called him into the McDonald's, which meant the decision that placed him at the center of the violence lasted only a few minutes. That memory followed her through every interview, making the final exchange with her son feel painfully ordinary, while everything afterward became impossible to explain. As the first arrest became public, Champagne admitted that CJ's friends had not stopped calling her, filling her phone with stories about the teammate, classmate, and friend they believed would eventually play football at a much higher level. Their memories carried her into the vigil held on February 18th at Broadway and West, 238th Street, where teammates, clergy, elected officials, and neighborhood residents gathered beside the same sidewalk where bullets struck 3 teenagers. Standing before the crowd, she spoke about birthdays, graduation, marriage, children, and every future milestone that disappeared alongside her son. Her words reached beyond the shooters, turning toward the institutions surrounding that intersection as she questioned how gunfire erupted only a short distance from the 50th precinct while students poured out after school. Brian Corley carried the grief differently, although it came from the same wound that shattered the rest of the family. Before additional suspects were arrested, he publicly criticized city leadership, expressing frustration that the people responsible still appeared free while his son's funeral approached. His comments also reached Mayor Zoran Mamdani, whose public statements about the tragedy failed to convince Corley that enough urgency surrounded the investigation. That frustration shifted weeks later after arrests in Connecticut brought Anthony Caballero and Zion Martinez back toward New York, allowing Corley to acknowledge that investigators had ultimately done the work he feared might never happen. The pain surrounding Christopher Redding's death quickly connected with people who understood that feeling long before February 2026 arrived. During one community gathering, activist Tyreek Goodman reminded everyone that he had been 16 when somebody shot him in the shoulder almost 2 decades earlier, making CJ's killing feel painfully familiar instead of shocking. Goodman asked why cameras covered nearly every corner while children continued getting shot anyway, pointing toward surveillance systems that solve crimes without preventing them. That question echoed through the crowd because everybody standing there had already watched another teenager become another investigation after another burst of gunfire. Organizations already working inside the Bronx also stepped forward, hoping their voices might interrupt the next conflict before another family received the same phone call. Bronx Rises Against Gun Violence, commonly known as BRAG, continued sending trained violence interrupters into neighborhoods experiencing repeated shootings, while Bronx Connect expanded work through its Release the Grip initiative by steering vulnerable teenagers toward jobs, mentoring, and structured activities. Those programs approached the problem from different directions, although both recognized that many conflicts developed long before anybody reached for a firearm. Their efforts reflected one side of the debate, while law enforcement carried another perspective built from years of responding after shootings had already happened. Assistant Chief Benjamin Gurley spoke openly about that reality, explaining that he never wanted another teenager wearing handcuffs or lying inside an ambulance after choosing to carry a gun. His message centered on intervention before violence, arguing that once officers arrived at crime scenes, every meaningful opportunity had already disappeared. Community organizers respected the urgency behind those words, although many insisted families like the Reddings had already provided guidance, discipline, encouragement, and support. Christopher had football coaches, caring parents, goals, structure, and dreams, yet none of those protections stopped a stray moment from ending his life. Other grieving families recognized that same cruel pattern almost immediately. Jennifer Gardner still carried the loss of her daughter, Antonia Campbell, who died after being shot during violence connected to a Bronx basketball tournament, while Carmen Ramos continued speaking about her brother, Emilio Rosas, who never returned from a simple trip to buy milk. Marisol Miranda transformed the murder of her son, Michael Hernandez Z, into public advocacy, standing beside parents she barely knew while understanding every emotion crossing their faces. Their names differed, their neighborhoods shifted, their tragedies unfolded under separate circumstances, although every story eventually reached the same destination, where memorial candles replaced ordinary family routines. The cycle stretched even further when people remembered 16-year-old Yvette Jeffrey, whose life ended after a stray bullet struck her near a Bronx schoolyard during another dispute that had nothing to do with her. Christopher Redding's story suddenly became part of a growing list, instead of an isolated tragedy, joining other teenagers whose futures disappeared through violence aimed elsewhere. Every vigil introduced another parent carrying photographs instead of children, while every rally produced familiar promises about safer streets, stronger communities, and better opportunities. Even so, another process continued quietly away from television cameras, as homicide detectives organized witness statements, surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and indictment papers that would soon place 3 young defendants inside a Bronx courtroom. By late March 2026, the criminal case had moved into Bronx Supreme Court after a grand jury returned indictments charging Sean Caballero, Anthony Caballero, and Zion Martinez with second-degree murder, first-degree manslaughter, attempted murder, criminal weapon possession, assault, and reckless endangerment. Each defendant appeared before the court before being remanded without bail, while prosecutors prepared for the next phase of the case. Detectives from the 50th Precinct, the Bronx Homicide Squad, and the Bronx Warrant Section continued organizing evidence alongside prosecutors, although one question remained unresolved. The unidentified female captured on surveillance footage before the shooting still had not been located, leaving one piece of the investigation unfinished. Christopher Redding's case unfolded while New York reported historically lower overall gun violence, creating statistics that sounded encouraging until people looked closer at the victims' ages. Overall, shootings had fallen across the city, while murders also declined, yet the percentage involving teenagers moved in the opposite direction. Bronx officials responded by restructuring borough police operations into separate Bronx North and Bronx South commands, hoping greater focus would improve public safety where violence continued clustering. Those numbers created a difficult contradiction because adults generally experienced a safer city while children increasingly faced the greatest danger walking home from school. That contradiction brings the story back to the image left behind after the gunfire stopped, which was never the pistol, the shell casings, or the police tape covering Broadway and West, 238th Street. It was Christopher Redding's backpack resting beside evidence markers, still holding whatever homework, football equipment, or personal belongings he expected to carry home later that evening. Nothing inside that bag ever became important enough to list publicly, although everything it represented mattered far more than anything investigators removed from the crime scene. It belonged to a teenager planning tomorrow instead of someone expecting to die before dinner. The criminal proceedings continue moving through the justice system while the buses still stop outside the same McDonald's every afternoon, allowing students to gather where Christopher Redding spent his final minutes. Sean Caballero, Anthony Caballero, and Zion Martinez continue awaiting the outcome of the charges against them, while the search for the remaining suspect remains unfinished. Football seasons continued after 2026, although Christopher never received another chance to wear the Kennedy Knights uniform or chase the future everyone around him believed was waiting. Life kept moving through Kingsbridge exactly as it always had, yet one backpack never truly left that sidewalk, reminding the neighborhood that ordinary afternoons sometimes become the stories nobody forgets.